I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And he did not channel his talents to narrower patterns. He wanted to be equal to the vast, babbling, spin-out sweep of contemporary culture here in the Great Concavity.
Well, Matt, welcome to episode 49.
Yeah, 49. It's an interesting number. That quote I want to qualify and say is from Don DeLillo.
It is.
And that is going to set us up for episode 49 being a little bit of a different sort of episode.
Mm-hmm. You'll notice, listener, that we have no guest this time, for example. It's just going to be Matt and I for this. Because something kind of fun and momentous happened last month in July, and it was that I got to come down to Austin, and I spent some time at the Ransom Center, finally, for the first time ever. And I had a good afternoon there, and I decided that I would just sit there with Wallace's letters to Don DeLillo, and I had a blast. And you and I have both read through all of them since. I didn't have time to read all of them there, obviously, so I took tons of photos, 150. And we're going to kind of go through them and unpack some of the highlights and some of the interesting points that we saw and adjacent type stuff to do with the Ransom Center in this episode.
Yeah, I was really excited you got to go there because I'd wanted you to be able to visit Austin, not just me in Austin, but come to the Ransom Center as well.
Yeah, I hit all the boxes. It's great.
Yeah, it was a really great trip. And, this is also something like I've wanted to do this kind of an episode before in the past where we focus on materials from the Ransom Center. Yeah. And, in the future, we might have a guest on and we might bring in multiple guests to talk about specific materials. I would my dream would be able to go through all of the finding aid and all of the boxes and be able to at least talk about the ideas of everything that's there, but it would be almost infinite. I mean, there's so much stuff there. Yeah. So I feel like we're starting with something here that is very high interest, and it's also very discreet. Like we can talk about them as a set of letters that are there. Yeah. So after we say, okay, we're going to do this kind of an episode where we talk about the DeLillo letters, one thing I thought that would be interesting, Dave, is if you could give us your take on what it's like, give us a description of doing research at the Ransom Center. The whole process. What was it like for you?
Yeah. Okay. So this was a really strange aspect of going there because when you think of a place that you've never been to, maybe you've seen a couple pictures, you have this, you construct this place in your mind out of what you think it's going to be like, but it's really not predicated on anything. And so when I thought people said that they went to the Wallace archive there, I thought they would go into a library type building, museum type building, and there was a room, and in that room was the Wallace archive, and there were maybe some desks, but all the papers were housed there, all the boxes, all the folders, and you could just go there and take whatever references you needed and sit at the desks and use them in this specifically designated Wallace archive room. As it turns out, that's not the case at all, and so that was a kind of funny mind trip for me to experience. Actually, you go up on the second floor of this building, and there's quite a huge library type room with, really gorgeously adorned. There's busts of writers throughout the 20th and 21st century all over it. And in fact, there's there's some very nice tables around the place, and you go to a computer system and you click what single box you would like to access, and then you wait a little while, and then the staff brings it out to you on a cart, and you can take one file at a time back to your desk space, and you can open it, and you can look at the materials that way. But obviously, we know that there's dozens and dozens of other writers whose archive is also housed there. So that was the first kind of, I guess, jarring aspect of it. It was so much different than I expected, just from like an architectural standpoint.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I had a different conception in that I used to work for the Division of Libraries at NYU, and they have a lot of special collections and archives. And so I had some experience there with the Fales Library and some of their collections. But even that's a completely different experience of, requesting the materials and being allowed to handle them and whatnot. And one thing that's unique about the Wallace, archive, we're referring to it as like a single thing, but in fact there are about 4 or 5 different finding aids, that tell you what's in that collection. And they, there's one that's just for things that Stephen Moore has donated or sold to the Ransom Center.
Yeah.
There's one that's just for Bonnie Nadell's collection of Wallace's stuff that she has donated or sold.
Yeah.
And then there's, one that Little Brown has done. And then some of these letters that we're talking about are not even in the Wallace archive. They're in the DeLillo archive.
Yeah, typically. So what I found is that letters that Wallace wrote to DeLillo are in the Wallace boxes. But then stuff that DeLillo responded to Wallace with would be in the DeLillo boxes, which I didn't actually have time to go through. But there are, in fact, a few DeLillo responses in the Wallace stuff. I'm not sure if that was a result of like cross-contamination or what. But it was cool to see a few DeLillo responses as well, because I'm also really interested in those,
Well, I think that there are things that he had saved and kept in there, but... Yeah, I don't know exactly how some letters ended up there and some ended up in the other thing.
Yeah.
They very well might have just been cataloged differently. So the Ransom Center has that at their discretion to move, things from box to box based on where it belongs. But some of this, I would say, is available online as well.
Yeah.
Like if you Google, David Foster Wallace letters with Don DeLillo, you'll find a few of them that they have put online and digitized.
Yeah. Another cool thing that I learned when I was there is that you can access their library database for the Ransom Center, like from any computer, I think. And you can look at what boxes they have of, any author's archive that they house there. And you can look at what kind of specific stuff is in each box and folder. So if you're mildly interested in what they have at the Ransom Center, you can just find that out for yourself online, which I had not known before. So that's a cool discovery from out of that. But you just sit there at that computer and you're scrolling through everything they have, and you're like, oh my gosh, I just want to come for like a month here, 8 hours a day, and just sit and read, So most people don't have that luxury, obviously. You're much more situated than anyone else. But
spent a fair amount of time in there, and it's coming up on 9 years since the Wallace Archive opened, I think. So in that 9 years, I mean, I've been there a lot.
Yeah.
I still don't know that I've seen everything per se, or that I remember everything that I've seen in that 9 years, but the description of the letters, I think we've kind of covered, is that they're in folders and they're in various boxes, some, like you say, in Wallace's finding aid and some in DeLillo's. And then we were talking earlier about the timeline of these, and I believe the first one is that Wallace writes a kind of half fan letter, half business letter to DeLillo in 1992. And I think that's the earliest one.
Yeah, that's the earliest one that I found, yeah.
And then I think the last one is in 2007. I didn't see any from 2008.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I have,
He might well have written, or there might have been letters in 2008 or emails.
Yeah,
honestly,
I'm fascinated,
I don't know if Don DeLillo does email.
Yeah, you kind of get the sense throughout the letters that Don DeLillo
he's a typewriter man.
He's a typewriter man all the way through and through. Yeah, exactly.
So we'll come back to that first letter because I think it's super interesting, actually.
Absolutely.
But I want to tell our listeners that we are not going to be reading whole letters. That these are still under copyright from the Wallace estate, and we are not actively seeking permission to reprint them even in audio form. So we're going to talk about the ideas in the letters and paraphrase some things, and not going to be reading directly from the letters. Unfortunately, if you want to come and spend some time with them, like I say, you need to do that at the Ransom Center. And on that note, I'll put in a quick plug for our conference next year in Austin, Texas. Put it on your calendar. June, I think it's 4, 5, and 6.
It is.
In Austin, Texas at the Ransom Center. And, come a day early, stay a day late, and you'll have the opportunity to go into the reading room and fight over which boxes people are requesting.
Yeah, that's going to be ultimate mayhem.
Wallace people there.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, one thing that when you show up there, you're given kind of a waiver that talks about some copyright stuff that you will not reproduce. You're allowed to take photographs of the material for your own records, but you're not allowed to reproduce them, share them in any kind of like internet type way. So we want to be extremely respectful of that here with this episode, and we don't want to reproduce anything, because that's a no. That's a no. But I think we can speak generally about them and some of our impressions.
Right. And, the first thing that comes to mind, I have a lot of questions while I was going through this, but, there's been attempts when Dave and I first met at the 2015 David Foster Wallace conference in Normal, Illinois, Bloomington. I guess it's really a Normal, but and Stephen Byrne was the keynote at that speaker, and he spoke. His keynote address was about the letters of David Foster Wallace and correspondence. And so I want to give a quick kind of, we talked about timeline stuff. I want to talk a little bit about, Wallace as a correspondent. And, he's a pretty unique correspondent in that he came of age before computers were ubiquitous. And, he was a late adopter of email, and we're lucky in this regard that he wrote tons of letters that people kept, that were on paper. Yeah. And that
was his email address, "Oh cap my cap," I believe.
Yeah, that's one of them. That was my first conference paper. Was all about his email address.
You did a whole paper about that?
Relationship with email.
Really?
Yeah.
Sweet. Send that my way.
I'll have to link to that in the show notes. It's reprinted in that first collection of.
Oh, yeah. Is it okay? Cool.
Normal essays.
Nice.
But Stephen Byrne had a pretty interesting kind of structure for his book of letters, which unfortunately I don't think the estate will now ever allow him to publish or reprint, which is too bad for us. But he still was able to give us a lot of information in that keynote, and I took some pretty furious notes. This is, again, 4 years ago, 2015. Yeah. And one thing I thought was interesting is that he broke down Wallace's career as a correspondent into like 3 different phases. And in that timeline, the first phase was kind of Wallace as an apprentice. And, he wrote to DeLillo in 1992. This is before Infinite Jest is published. He's still working on Infinite Jest.
Yeah, pretty early stages too, right?
Yeah. And, we'll get into that a little bit more. But the phase of him writing to kind of older writers that he looked up to, DeLillo was part of that, but he also had correspondence with David Markson. And, even in the late 80s, early 90s, whenever Wittgenstein's Mistress came out and he wrote that long essay about it, he started a correspondence with David Markson, and all those letters are also in the Ransom Center. Maybe we can talk about them at some point. But he also wrote to writers like Richard Ford and Tobias Wolff, and some of his teachers who were professors at the University of Arizona, including Richard Ellman, who was kind of literary scout / agent / teacher at the time. This is 1986 or so, late 1985 into 1987, 1988. And, the Paris Review just published this thing about his correspondence with this woman named Susan Barnett. And in there, it's mentioned, that Wallace's letters to Ellman were sold at Sotheby's, I think in 2011, 2012, somewhere around there. So the Ellman fits into this phase where, pretty much up until about 1991, 1992, Wallace was writing to older sort of writers that he looked up to, that he considered masters, and asking for advice. I wonder in there if he ever wrote to Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, actually.
That's a question mark for me.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know if there are any of those letters, and maybe one day we'll find out in the Cormac McCarthy archive. I also slightly recall Stephen Byrne mentioning that maybe he had written to Kathy Acker. We should follow up with Stephen Byrne and get him to, if he could, talk about this issue. But I think that there are other writers that he admired. Part of me wonders, did he ever write to Thomas Pynchon?
Yeah, well, Pynchon comes up a little bit, especially in the later letters. I would be fascinated.
Part of me wonders if there are Pynchon DeLillo letters.
Yeah, totally.
and both of those guys still living, there could be writing letters to each other right now.
That is possible.
Which is a pretty crazy idea. But, it's pretty exciting, I think, for literary archivists and for literary scholars to contemplate what's still out there. And I think there's a lot. So anyways, the next phase of his career that Byrne defines is after Infinite Jest comes out. Most of Wallace's correspondence actually shifts to his contemporaries, people who are writing and publishing the same time as he is. Most of that is Jonathan Franzen, who we'll talk about more. But also in there are some letters to William T. Volman, to Richard Powers, to Jeffrey Eugenides, and I think Stephen Byrne also said to Carol Meso and Mary Caponegro. And if you haven't read Mary Caponegro, I think she's super interesting experimental writer, and she deserves more attention. And I would love to know if she and Wallace were correspondents, if anyone has seen those letters or has done any research on that. I'd love to know more about that.
Cool.
But he's still, at the same time, we should say, carrying on correspondence with Don DeLillo, for almost the rest of his life.
Yeah, totally. I didn't number how many letters there are. I didn't count them, but I'm going to do a quick guess. So there's probably like 30-ish pieces of correspondence in there, give or take.
Per side, maybe. I mean, it's hard to say because some of the Wallace ones are kind of like fragments. We'll talk about that too.
Totally. Some of them are like one or two sentences. Yeah.
And then Byrne also identifies going into the 2000s, in the early 2000s, is that Wallace himself, after Infinite Jest comes out, after supposedly Fun Thing comes out, after Brief Interviews comes out, he becomes the older writer.
Right.
Who younger writers are writing into him. And, that's pretty interesting for him to be on the receiving end of that admiration. And that's, he named letters from Dave Eggers, from Zadie Smith, from Arthur Bradford. And I would, the Eggers and Bradford were kind of in that McSweeney's crowd, as was marginally Zadie Smith. But, I would put in some more names in there who I know of younger writers who corresponded with him. And that would be also this guy who I've emailed with before named Mac Barnett. And he's a children's writer, but he was a student of Wallace's at Pomona. And I think there are several of those who were students of Wallace's who became somewhat successful. And Mac is super successful. And he's, a full-time writer. He's won a bunch of awards, and he's written this ton of children's books. And I'd also put in that group now Brandon Hobson, who wrote a letter to Wallace in 1993 as a struggling writer and got a pretty good response from Wallace. Wallace didn't have a lot of fan letters in 1993. And now Brandon himself is a successful writer and was a finalist for the National Book Award last year with Where the Dead Sit Talking.
Whoa.
So
Okay.
Brandon is
That's cool.
Quite a success story now, and is a teacher, assistant professor at New Mexico State, where another young writer used to teach, an acquaintance of mine named Evan Lavender Smith. And Evan Lavender Smith brought Wallace out to New Mexico State in 2006 for a reading where this is, if you've ever heard this story, Wallace read from a section of the Fogel section of The Pale King, where the father is sort of killed in a horrific subway accident. And he was told after that, like, maybe don't ever read that part again, like, in public.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But I think Robert Boswell was there, maybe from Texas, and his pal from Arizona, Antonio Nelson. So, we're putting a lot of names out here in these categories, Dave, but I think that there are tons of other writers who he corresponded with briefly. I mean, can you think of any other names?
Oh, I'm just going to try and rack my brain to, like, what was it, July, like, 15th or something I was there.
I just thought of one.
Okay, I'm sure.
Whenever
Save
the
me.
Wallace...
Save me, Matt.
Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought.
I didn't have a train to begin with. It's fine.
Well, I just remembered that whenever the Ransom Center acquired the archive of Corrigesson Boyle, T. Corrigesson Boyle, and a couple of years ago, I went looking through that find aid, and there was a letter from David Foster Wallace, and I was like, I want to see what this is. And I think it was a letter from when Wallace was at the Sonora Review in his MFA program at Arizona, and he was writing to ask him for a free book. And so there's a lot of that in the letters from Wallace, especially in the 80s and 90s, when he would write to Markson, when he'd write to Stephen Moore. It was often like, hey, I can't find my copy of that. Could you send me one if you get that? Or like, I'll promise I'll return it. Or it was a lot of just getting free books.
Yeah,
so some of the letters not super interesting.
Right, we're a bit guilty of that too. Contacting people like Bloomsbury Academic and like, hey, we see you have 4 new Wallace titles. You want to? We'd be happy to review those if you like.
It's a little different. I mean, I think honestly,
they're getting publicity out of it.
He was interested in that because books are expensive, and if you can get them for free, why not? Yeah,
especially some of these academic books that cost like upwards of $100. Like, free one of those seems good. Thank you.
But this list I was saying of like the different phases, him as an apprentice, him kind of as a genius at the top of his powers, and then kind of in his emeritus phase where he's the elderly fish.
Yeah, right.
What that leaves out, what that does not include, is the letters that he wrote to his close friends, like Mark Costello, Corey Washington, the letters that he wrote to his family, like his sister and his mom, his girlfriends, his fans. There's tons and tons of fan letters out there.
Yeah, we get folks emailing us sometimes talking about some of the correspondence that they had with him in the 90s or whatever. That's cool to hear about.
Yep, and I mean, I think that he wrote practically everyone back.
Yeah, that is really astonishing. I think there's something about that in the biography, and I remember reading it and just being really surprised and delighted by that. The generosity of someone of his stature, responding to every letter. It seems pretty crazy.
Well, not just that, but sometimes people, random strangers would write in and be like, hey, can you sign my book and mail it back to me? And I think Bonnie told a story about him going to the post office on 2 days before Christmas, and everyone's trying to mail Christmas gifts.
Right.
Have to wait in line for an hour, and him waiting in line just to mail back some random stranger's signed book.
I remember hearing that.
Christmas.
Yeah.
But anyways, we're focusing not on those letters, that are more business-like. There's a lot of letters in the Ransom Center that are to and from translators, editors, agents, colleagues, even some of his students' letters. What I think we're interested in and what Stephen Byrne was interested in is those letters to and from other writers.
Yeah.
And, especially with DeLillo, who he saw as a mentor and someone he could trust and someone he could go to for advice. I think they have probably the most interesting relationship of all of his correspondence outside of maybe Jonathan Franzen.
So you're saying I picked the right boxes?
I think you did.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they've, like I say, they're high interest in that.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been interested in these letters because they are so meaty. There's a lot of depth to them.
Yeah, and I think too, like if you are somebody who likes the writing of David Foster Wallace, there's a pretty good shot that you are also going to be a huge fan of Don DeLillo and vice versa. Like they have a very different writing style, in terms of like sentence on the page type stuff, but I think they're really interested in a lot of the same big questions. Like their themes are very similar, and you can just tell, like if you read them side by side, like these guys are going to go out for dinner and have a wildly interesting and captivating conversation.
Although I think they only met twice.
Yeah. And that's something that we'll see in the letters. Yeah, totally. And
that's a pretty
Wallace
interesting
has
side effect.
Yeah, and we'll get to it specifically, but there's such a great part where he tells Don that like seeing him in person kind of ruined it for him, like ruined the persona of the author that he had built in his mind, constructed of Don DeLillo, and now he sees words coming out of his face and the way he tilts his head and stuff like that, and it kind of like killed it for him in a way. And that's
that was a bunch of crap to me, and I felt like that's kind of like
yeah, that's possible.
I don't know, man. There's a lot going on there. I mean, Wallace definitely like just socially awkward, could be uncomfortable in those kind of situations where it's like don't meet your heroes. That's a common thing, but
right, yeah.
He did meet him, and I don't. We'll get to that, but
sure.
I don't know. I don't know how much I believe that, or that he was brown nosing in that.
Yeah, yeah.
But the first letter, what I want to say with Franzen is that Wallace uses Franzen's connection to DeLillo, to kind of insert himself into a letter, and that in the letter, the first letter he writes to DeLillo, he has this funny image. It says that he saw a signed copy of Libra under a discreet spotlight in Franzen's home, and almost fell over. Like, how do you know Don DeLillo? And kind of freaked out that like, oh my God, you've actually met him. And Franzen's like, oh yeah, I've written him letters. And he writes back, you should write to him.
Yeah.
And they were both, I think Franzen and Wallace were both living in Syracuse at the time. Like I say, this is 1992.
Yeah, June 92. Letter 1.
Mary Carr is still there. And he's, writing Infinite Jest. And I don't know if you picked up on this, Dave, where he says, I think on the second page of the letter, he says something about that he's already written a piece that owes a debt to Endzone. And, that's obvious. This is the Eschaton piece, right? Like,
yeah, that comes up later too, where he basically says that he feels like he maybe plagiarized like the essence of one of the scenes from it with Eschaton. But yeah,
but clearly DeLillo didn't think so. I mean, he made it completely his own, but he uses that as a sort of business reason, like I say, to change it from a fan letter of like, hey, I'm not just some unknown writer.
Right.
I'm actually contacting you because, I can send you the proofs of the manuscript whenever it comes out or whatever, and you can check it to make sure that it's okay with you.
Yeah.
I just think he kind of manufactures that a little bit because it's like
Yeah.
it owes a debt to it, but you don't actually need to run it. But I mean, what would DeLillo's say? Like, oh no, you're using my idea. That's it's not even close to the same thing.
I don't think we'd be where we are
anything.
in American letters or world literature at all if every writer had to, you know, solicit the permission of the writer before them that they're kind of like loosely taking an idea from and like riffing,
Right.
you know, like we wouldn't be very far if that was the case. So yeah, it's pretty funny that he does that. There is a very funny line in the first letter where, yeah, it comes out that Franzen contacted DeLillo first and had the hubris to send him a unsolicited copy of one of his own books. Like, here, Don, in case you need some extra reading material, here's one of my books, which is like, I mean, for you and me, like, we only would just laugh at that, right? We've talked about Franzen on the show before a little bit, and it struck me as very funny.
It did strike me as very funny too.
Yeah.
And you know, one thing that also struck me is that this being in 1992, I sort of think of this as one of the golden periods of Wallace's life, even though he was having a lot of problems with Mary Carr and a pretty bad relationship. And
and I think a lot of addiction stuff around this time as well.
No, he's clean. He's out of the...
Oh, this is after.
in
Okay.
AA.
Okay, yeah.
He's out of
still living with addiction, though. Yeah. Right.
But it's actually one of the best periods work-wise in that he's not teaching. And he is just living in this little tiny apartment in Syracuse where it's freezing cold and there's nothing else to do except for like stay inside and read and write.
Yeah.
And I kind of get that sense from these early letters is that Wallace, as you know, he's always at the height of his lexical powers, but especially when he's writing Infinite Jest and he's in this little apartment and, you know, he wants to impress Don DeLillo. That's a big deal.
I mean, you kind of have to on the first letter a little bit, right?
Right.
If you want to get a response and start a dialogue. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's, you know, that's a really special letter, as are, you know, a lot of these earlier ones where he's trying to establish himself as someone worthy of DeLillo's time. And another thing I noticed in this first letter is that you can kind of see a couple of other little influences leaking out in this letter, and that he mentions Manuel Puig twice.
Yeah, he says that Don like has informed his heart and his work and inspired him as a writer more than any other, except for maybe along with Manuel Puig. Yeah.
And I thought that's interesting because the Puig doesn't get enough credit as like Wallace clearly took the ellipsis, the ... in quotation marks from him.
Right.
Like that was a Puig thing, and other people had done it before, but Wallace admitted several times, like, no, I saw that in a Puig book and I just completely copied it.
Right.
So Lucas Thompson, when we had him on the show, we talked about Puig a little bit with him.
Yes, that's
and
right.
There is some good analysis in Lucas's book called Global Wallace. But I feel like there should be more, especially of this kind of key period where he's writing to Don DeLillo, but mentioning another writer, which is kind of like taboo. Like, you kind of don't do that.
Like you're my favorite, but also next to my other favorite, who's this person.
Yeah. And he also does that with DeLillo's books at one point where he's like, you know, Libra is my favorite, but I can't really read it right now because I'm writing my own thing. I don't want it to inform me. Or he said, you know, he wrote a thing about LBJ, but he doesn't say he wrote about LBJ, but he wrote a thing about LBJ.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't read it anymore. He's like, parts of Ratner's Star inspired me, parts of Americana, or Americana's my favorite, which is like probably not a compliment to DeLillo because it's his first book.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, but then he kind of like says like he has favorites of yours, but parts of it, and I was like, that's kind of taboo as well.
Right.
Like,
yeah. He front
I don't know
loads.
if I would say that to a writer.
Yeah.
Like, I liked part of your novel.
Yeah. He's very effusive about Libra throughout all the letters. But then, as we'll get to, Underworld comes out, and then he, you know, that sends him into the stratosphere, I think. But he's also like very positive about Cosmopolis, which we'll talk about later too, which I think is kind of like, there's some really good prose in that book, like with like
it's
any DeLillo, but yeah, I'd put it very low on my list of favorites. So yeah.
But in between there, so there's another period where, so after 1992, DeLillo writes him back, and he, I think, flips out. In 1995, he writes this long letter, kind of begging for advice of, he's still finishing Infinite Jest. He's moved to Illinois, and he's still trying to figure out how to. I feel like he's asking, like, how do I really become this I want to be a great writer. How do I become that? And I'm, I'm paraphrasing here, but
are you referring to the letter where he's like, how do you overcome procrastination? What are like your writing habits? Like he asks them like a long list of questions like that. Is that what you're after?
Yeah. And okay. He also says, I think of I think maybe DeLillo says at first that the novel's like a killer, right? It's a
that's
killer.
A good, the novel's a fucking killer is what he says. Killer.
And I think that made a big impression on Wallace, and he recognized that, and he says to DeLillo, like, how do I deal with this, because it's not fun for me. And DeLillo's like, it's not fun for me writing about these kind of evil guys sometimes either, but that's what we're here to do. And he kind of encourages him to buckle down, and says something like let other people complain about book tours. And we'll complain about like what's deeper, right?
Yeah, totally, that's right. Going back to the first letter, my favorite line, and I think I like laughed out loud in the archive when I read this, was that he's like, if you value your privacy as much as I assume you do, you'll be gratified to learn that I had to go to pretty grotesque lengths to get a hold of your address. And I kind of wonder, like, is DeLillo's address still the same? Because it's verbatim, like, in these letters.
Well, and it's all over the internet. Like, those letters are published verbatim all over the internet.
Right.
And I think even someone on Reddit who posted these letters said, like, holy crap, is that still, like, DeLillo's address? But, what are you going to do? Are you going to go stalk Don DeLillo? Like, that's pretty...
Right. Yeah, that would be weird. Larry McCaffrey also is mentioned in the first letter, which is fun because, this is before the McCaffrey interview. He's called a very chatty compadre of Tom LeClaire. This is a year before the big interview, the 1993 interview that's so
But see,
oft-cited.
I felt like he's just dropping names to try to get cred.
He's definitely trying to align their social network, isn't he? He's like connecting the dots. Like, I know this person, mutual people. It's kind of his in a little bit, I think. Yeah. Friends. And he also says that speaking of plagiarism, that DeLillo should sue the slats off Oliver Stone for ripping off Libra for JFK.
Yeah, which I don't agree with at all. That's not a ripoff of Libra at all.
But then he uses that to say like, oh, also I probably also plagiarized Endzone a bit. Out of respect, I'm telling you this, like, not for legal reasons.
Yeah, which I don't agree with at all. Like that he plagiarized anything.
Right.
Inspired by some ideas. He's way on the other side of, but that line about going to great lengths to get the address, I will say that, like, in New York publishing circles or whatever, that Don DeLillo's address would be extremely easy to get way back in the day. So he's sort of
more so than Pynchon's or something, I'm sure.
Well, I'll also tell you that it's like, even in New York publishing circles, not a great secret that of what Thomas Pynchon's address is, and that's. I mean, he's a human being who lives somewhere and doesn't, obfuscate his address of going through, sending stuff to his publisher and going through his agent and stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, like, he gets his author copies shipped somewhere, and I mean, he's an old guy now, and like, he does have an address, and there are people at publishing houses that know it. They respect his privacy, but even he is not the most well-known, like most reclusive human being of all time.
Sure,
like,
I'm sure that's true. Yeah,
he's reclusive, but someone's sending him author copies, and he's getting paid, and he's getting a check and everything. So.
Right. There's this great line about this in, I think it's a 98 letter to DeLillo, which we'll get to also, but where he jokes about like how DeLillo must encrypt letters to his home address in like aluminum foil and like reroute them through mail drop boxes in briny breezes, Florida. Wallace has some fun with that.
And I'll say,
too,
just as someone who worked in New York publishing briefly and knew a bunch of people who worked at Penguin and worked on Thomas Pynchon's books, it's a secret, but it ain't like 100%. It's not like the Pentagon, okay?
Yeah, sure.
It's like they will not kill you if you accidentally come across his home address.
Yeah.
And that's like the famous picture that was of, Thomas Pynchon is like some jerk did that and like staked out his place and took, paparazzi photos of everyone who came out of the building. And it's like, you can do that, but it's like not cool.
It's not cool. Like even when, you and I went to Wallace's former home in Bloomington, like that felt super creepy just doing that. And, that was in 2016, like long after he lived there and, 8 years after his death. So I can't imagine doing that while someone's alive, like that takes a certain kind of gall.
Speaking of that house, is that he buys that house or mentions that he just bought that house in that 1995 letter that I'm referring to.
It comes up a couple times.
Yeah, and so he had moved to Illinois, to Bloomington, but had not finished Infinite Jest, or it had not been published yet. And he mentions that it's next to a horse pasture, which when you go there, it's like not really next to a horse pasture.
Well, it's definitely like a large enclosement, that you could see horses being in. I don't think there were when we went there, but
I don't even think it was enclosed. It's not even.
No, you don't think so?
It's a little bit exaggerated, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's possible.
The movie of like the end of the tour kind of exaggerates that as well. But so going there, I think, has a little bit of value. Whether or not you need to stop the car and get out and walk around, probably not.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the film, in End of the Tour, there's like a huge field across the street from his house, right? Like a big open. That's certainly not the case. There's houses on the other side of the street there.
And there is a field next to him. Yeah. And another house behind him, and then another road, but it's like it's a little bit off anyways.
Yeah, totally.
The other thing I'll mention about that 1995 letter is he mentions Mark Costello, and the reason why he mentions Mark Costello is that Mark Costello had just married Nan Graham,
right,
who was DeLillo's longtime editor, and she was in the process then in 1995 of bringing DeLillo with her to her new publisher, which I think she was moving to Scribner at that time.
Okay.
So, interestingly, she was also Mary Carr's editor on The Liars Club.
Right. And her name comes up a lot in these letters, Nan.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's like his best friend from college. Yeah. Is Mark Costello.
Yeah, the co-author of Signifying Rappers.
If you go online, you'll find like interviews with Mary Carr where she says she's the one that set up Mark and Nan Graham on a date.
Oh, really? That's fun.
Yeah, and that was her editor, and she thought Mark Costello's a great guy, and they're both single, and they should meet up. And so Mary Carr is the one who introduced them. And so Wallace is very much like using that as like, I'm part of the crew too, right? It's like, I'm good
my
friends
best
with
friend
Mark.
in the world, he calls him in that letter, right?
Yeah, it's his best friend in the world, and then he just happens to marry Don DeLillo's editor.
Yeah.
It's like lucky for Dave.
I know
that your best friend married someone who is not just an insider in New York publishing, but like freaking legendary publisher.
Yeah, totally.
So that does come up, as does the Franzen connection. There's a lot, like you say, about almost every letter. It seems like it mentions Franzen or Mark Costello and Nan Graham.
Yeah, they come up a lot. Yeah, John, Jon.
John, right.
Do you want to go through them chronologically?
Yeah, why don't you do that? Why don't you go into the 1993?
Yeah, okay. So it opens with DD. It's like Dear DD, Don DeLillo. And there's a fun evolution of like playful names that Dave calls Don throughout the letters too, which we'll get to
One
later.
is D squared. Right?
D squared. That's my favorite one, yeah. That comes much later, doesn't it? I think like 95 or 96 he starts using that.
Maybe even later, yeah.
Yeah, but a really cool thing out of the 93 letters that Wallace is applying for the Guggenheim, and he says the Teutonic thumb was down on yours truly Guggenheim-wise. And he thanks him for being a reference. Yes, Don DeLillo had been a reference for him for the Guggenheim, which that's a pretty cool revelation. Later in another letter, it comes up again that he's been urged by Eugenides and Franzen to reapply because now he's got more cachet post Infinite Jest, and he should ask DeLillo again for reference. So Wallace does, but he's like very tail between his legs, like falling over himself to say, but like if you don't have time/will, like please don't do this kind of thing.
Well, and what's so great about this is that it's fictionalized in the story Death Is Not the End, about the poet, right?
Oh,
who
okay.
is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Prize, just like Wallace, but yet in a footnote, never the recipient of a John Phillips Guggenheim Award, despite multiple applications.
Right.
And I mean, you got to think, like, you look at the list of people who've won a Guggenheim, and it's like extremely long, like much longer than the number of people who've won a MacArthur. And how the hell did Wallace not get one with a letter of recommendation from Don DeLillo?
Yeah.
And I mean, God knows who else he had in the application. I'd love to see the application.
Me too.
He gets Don DeLillo to write a letter and he still doesn't get it. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Woof. Yeah. That's nuts.
One other thing about, I think it's in the 92 letter or the 93 letter that he, when he talks about Libra, is that he makes some allusion to the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald and David Foster Wallace both have 3 names.
Yes.
And I thought that was great because, like, sometimes that's been like a subject of like a meme or a joke. And it's like he recognized that from day one. So
yeah, there's a specific okay. So there's some of the letters don't have dates on them, and it's hard to know how to exactly place them chronologically. So I kind of have a section here in my notes at the end of like undated letters, but I assume that they try to arrange them chronologically in the folders, if that's even possible. But yeah, he says like seeing his full name in print makes him feel like Lee Harvey Oswald and Libra. Maybe that's another reason why it's like my favorite book of yours, kind of a thing. And he also talks about how it was like foisted on him by his agent at the time to put his middle name in because there's already a writer named David Wallace. But he was like, I was 23 at the time. If my agent told me to use the name Seymour Butts, I totally would have. Like, he was just...
And you know, that's funny. I've heard this thing a million times, but if you go to the Ransom Center and you look at a lot of his early writings, even in college or even in high school
or elementary school,
before he published anything with an agent, he signed a lot of stuff as David Foster Wallace. So it's not like everyone called him David Wallace or Dave, which they probably did, except at school where he was in school a lot, you know, especially at Amherst.
Yeah.
And he signed a ton of stuff there and wanted to be called David Foster Wallace formally. So it's like, I hear what you're saying, but I don't believe you.
Yeah.
And there's even a thing that you like to say at the some of his earliest stuff, you know, his schoolwork, like I say, from his very early age, he would sign as David Foster Wallace. And I think some of that is like his love for his mom. Right. Yeah. And he's not going to say that to Don DeLillo, but like it honors his mom to say Sally Foster Wallace. And like, you know, he's unique like that. And he's kind of named like his mom. And I think he was really proud of that.
Yeah. I guess another thing to mention since we recorded last is that Wallace's father passed away I don't think that's...
Yeah, we didn't mention that.
Yeah.
But that did go around on the...
Totally.
On the social networks, and people pass that around. It's really, our condolences to the Wallace family if any of them are listening. But it was really sad news to hear James Wallace had passed away, I think in July.
Yeah. And there's mentions too, even in these letters, some of which I was like reading today even, about his parents, about his dad, about what his dad does for work, about how he's like, specializes in like biomedical ethics and questions of like what constitutes human life and things like that, in the context of like some of DeLillo's fiction, The Body Artist specifically.
Yeah, and I think DeLillo probably was interested in a lot of those same issues.
Oh no, it's the play. It's the play that he says he's going to pass on to his father.
Right.
Love Lies Bleeding.
Love Lies Bleeding.
Yeah, that's a September 2004 letter. He mentions in the 93 letter that he got kind of like a cushy, absurd job at ISU where he doesn't really have to teach that much. He gets to write. He doesn't have to do any committee stuff. Makes a living wage. That's kind of sweet to make that sort of personal connection, having been there a few times and, knowing like Charlie Harris and Victoria Harris and Robert McLaughlin, who, got Wallace the job there. It's fun to like see those little glimmers that you've been to these places and you're connecting the dots.
Yeah, I thought that was great too, where after he settled in there a bit and the 1996 Infinite Jest comes out and it's a super busy year for Wallace, and that he's also finishing the manuscript for A Supposedly Fun Thing. And he's working on several other things in addition to teaching. He had just finished the Lost Highway piece about David Lynch, which was about to be included in the book and about to be published in a magazine. So he had a ton of work going on in 1996, and yet he somehow finds time to read Underworld in manuscript or in page proofs and offer, detailed comments, everything from copy edits to structural changes. His comments on Underworld were insane, and that's we could almost do a whole nother episode just about Underworld.
Is that in the archive, do you know?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it is. Okay. I didn't see that.
And I think that it's in late 1996 that he submits it back to DeLillo, and DeLillo doesn't reply until February of 1997, but you can tell that it seriously made an impression on Don DeLillo that someone like Wallace had read the book so closely and offered a ton of constructive feedback. Again, Wallace was at the height of his teaching powers at this point too, right? Where he's a super new teacher at ISU and he wants to, make a good impression and work hard. And he has the opportunity to, review or workshop what might be Don DeLillo's like masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I think that he was super energized by this. And, when you mentioned his dad too, that reminds me that in one of the letters to DeLillo, he mentions that his dad had this memory of hearing the shot heard around the world, Bobby Thompson home run, Pafko at the wall.
Yeah.
And Don DeLillo got a huge kick out of that and gave his own story about where he was when he heard the shot heard around the world. Yeah. So, for DeLillo scholars, like there's a ton of great material in these letters, and that I think Wallace helps bring out from DeLillo.
Yeah.
But I was just super impressed of how much he had going on in 1996, and yet he managed to read all of Underworld.
Yeah. No kidding, right?
And like give comments on it.
There's this rad part in the 93 piece letter where he's trying to figure out some kind of character connection in Ratner's Star. And he's like, can you help me solve this DeLillo scholarship conundrum for 993? Like the date? Like, yeah, that's good.
I just, since I brought up Lost Highway, I just want to say that I found it kind of disappointing that Wallace hated the final product of Lost Highway, because I actually think it's a great film. Like, maybe not, Lynch's best work, but is it like super interesting film and like valuable? Totally.
Yeah, and we'll get to this later too, but he makes some pretty disparaging remarks about Magnolia by Paul Thomas Anderson.
I know, and I freaking love that movie.
I do too. I really like it. I like almost everything that Anderson does, if not all.
He hated Magnolia.
Yeah, it's pretty scathing. We'll quote a couple choice lines a bit later, I think, but
it's too harsh, man. It's way too
really
harsh for me.
Yeah, totally. Okay, third piece. Here we are, 56 minutes in. We're on the third letter. Maybe this might be a 2-part episode, everybody. Maybe we'll cut this off at about an hour and a half and then release part 2 a week later or something.
We'll edit this down and let you know what we end up with. If this ends up being a 3-parter, who knows?
3-parter, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about in these letters, and I would say now I'd love to hear for people who have spent time with them too, like what did you find interesting about them? Let's put that out, into Twitter and like conversation, and just tell us what we missed.
Absolutely.
But we're not done yet. Like you say, we've only been through a couple of actual letters.
Yeah, and this is by no means comprehensive either, and partially because we're a bit handcuffed there. We can't give too much specificity. We can't read them out loud or anything, but we can give a kind of a sense of them. So there's an undocumented date-wise just little note about Wallace mentioning a George Saunders story in Harper's 1994 September story called Isabel. And that's about it. And that's just like a piece of paper that's in this folder. So even in 94, Saunders was on Wallace's radar. I found that interesting, personally.
Yeah, I thought that he was trying to do DeLillo a favor, saying like, hey, check out this guy. Here's a recommendation.
Yeah, totally. And that brings us to the 4th letter, May 1995. He's just saying hi. There's some pretty funny, like, writerly stuff here where some familiar Wallace imagery comes out, like the dribbling infant, that follows you around with, neurospinal fluids pouring out of it.
Which he stole from DeLillo.
And making ghastly noises, So he's like, I hope your long thing, your underworld manuscript isn't following you around NYC doing that. Like this great concavity baby or something,
I also felt by this point, he's a couple of years, 2 or 3 years into writing to Don DeLillo, and this has got to be in the back of his mind a lot. And sometimes he kind of invents a reason to write to DeLillo.
Yeah, totally.
Like, he doesn't really have a reason, but he just like wants to write to his pen pal.
Yeah, totally.
Which is totally acceptable.
Yeah.
Like I do the same. I think it's a great idea, but you can see him sometimes making up an excuse to write, or like not even making up an excuse to write, and just sending like a Christmas card and stuff.
Oh yeah, there's lots of Christmas cards. There's lots of postcards. Yeah, this is the one that we were talking about a bit ago, where he's just like, mentions that his best friend in the world, Mark Costello, is marrying Nan Graham, and then he mentions like a dinner that DeLillo and Paul Auster had at Nan's very long table a couple months before they like housed him in their attic to work for a little while. So yeah, it's just like he's making those like social connections. Like, here's how we're in the same kind of ether together, the same like literary stratosphere, I guess you could say.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think later on, a couple years after this letter, after they've met, Wallace says this a couple times where he's like, I heard through the grapevine or whatever that you've maybe finished something, and maybe you've got a new one coming.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of like proof that Wallace would himself engage in a form of literary gossip.
Yeah. But the way he phrases that is so funny. He's like, the grapes don't really grow out in my neck of the woods, but I've heard that like, and it took me like a couple reads to be like, oh, he's like making a joke about the grapevine. Like, I heard it through the grapevine, even though they don't really grow in Illinois.
But you got to think that's either Franzen or Nan Graham via
Mark
Costello,
yeah, totally.
who are saying things, and he doesn't want to say like, hey, Mark Costello ratted you out.
Yeah, he ate
Told
cheese
you
on you and
friends
told
and-
me about like this opus that you've just finished. Yeah. Yeah, Wallace
Yeah,
talks about like turning his own fluid dribbler into Little Brown in this letter here, this 95 letter, and like this was interesting. They cut 310 pages from the fucker over winter. It's still pretty long, he says. And then the copy editor, they say there's probably going to be like another 100 pages cut. And he's like, he has this section where he kind of wrestles with like, I don't want to be like a commercial slut, essentially, where like I'm cutting all these pages just to save this company money, or because they'll make more money if it's shorter and more people will read it. It's like, you know, these commercial reasons seem kind of dirty and irksome. Plus also they're like obviously taking a pretty big risk on this almost 1,100 page novel. So he doesn't want to be a prima donna and fuck them over, he says. a P dash Donna is how he phrases it.
Donna,
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, Peach's point of view on this whole editing process is also informs us, because there are tons of letters between Wallace and Peach at this time, and those are super entertaining.
Yeah, I want to read those too at some point.
And you know, at the memorial thing for Wallace in 2008 at NYU, you know, Peach quoted from some of those letters there, and they were just, you know, hilarious. The way that Wallace would defend something of a thing that he didn't want to cut, and he really fought for a lot of stuff that he didn't want to cut. But you know, like any good sort of teacher-student relationship, he did end up cutting a fair amount of stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, you see this with younger writers, right, where they get notes from an agent or an editor or a mentor, and they ignore it. You know, they don't want to take the notes.
Right. Yeah.
But
Wallace is no exception.
Well, and I think when he was younger, he didn't want to either. And I think he's still young when he's writing Infinite Jest, but he matured a little bit enough where he could say, I mean, he matured a lot. He was a genius, right? But who am I to say? But you see this with writers where he didn't want to take the notes.
Yeah.
And he took the notes with Infinite Jest for the most part. You know, he figured out what he could fight for and what was worth fighting for. And then what was not. And that's a very like cold calculating thing. And I think part of him maybe thought, oh, Don DeLillo doesn't have to do this. And I think he was looking for some validation there. Like, yeah, Don, you do this too, right? Like you cut stuff. But I mean, to him, Don DeLillo was this like paragon of art, you know, who would never cut anything.
Right. Wallace uses that word in some cases too, paragon, in reference to him,
But in fact, I think DeLillo turns out to be pretty savvy and like pretty business-like in his approach as an author and working with an editor, and is not at all what Wallace imagines him to be like as a writer who is being edited. So yeah, there's a lot going on there in that relationship, I think, when he asks about them.
Yeah, this is the letter where he talks about buying that house, small and brick, next to a horse pasture. He likes the fact that he owns his house now. He doesn't have to pay off a landlord's mortgage. And then he says, like, anyway, here's my address, like, for your files. Which is such a Wallacean way to put it.
That was necessary
like,
before
for your files,
email, you know.
Like
You had to write down people's email or physical addresses, have an address book.
Yeah. I just meant specifically his use of the word like being just such a surfer kind of interpolation, you know, throw it in there. like whatever for your files, man, like that's just your opinion. It's very Big Lebowski-esque.
Very much. and DeLillo even mentions that in his memorial thing for Wallace, which I read from at the beginning of this episode, and that he calls it, I think, Dave's plain song. The offsetting breeze of Dave's plain song, words like okay then and sort of and no kidding and stuff like this. You know, that's all kind of stuff like DeLillo would never say.
Right. Know? Yeah. And then he finished, or near the end he says, like, this is Dave's voice, American. Yep. I think, right?
Yep.
And you were at that service.
I was, and it was, you know, I don't know if I've talked about it on the show or not, but it was...
Yeah, I'm not sure if you have.
very impressive and very memorable thing to have Don DeLillo go up to the microphone, and the first word out of his mouth is this booming like infinity. It's like such a DeLillo thing to say. Like start a sentence with a single word.
What's the biggest thing you can think of, Don? Infinity. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Carry on. Tell us about your friend.
I mean, however, I think his was the most memorable of those memorials, and like that's the one that I go back to a lot. I loved, Saunders, Zadie Smith, Michael Peach. They all did a great job. Yeah. But I mean, having Don DeLillo up there, he's gonna be Don DeLillo, and I think about the ending of that a lot, where he says,
"Not another word."
One of Wallace's stories, and he's meaning good old Neon, ends with this half sentence of "not another word," and DeLillo says, "But there's always another word. There's always another reader to regenerate these words. The words don't stop coming." And I think there he's almost talking to Wallace, dead, and really, if Wallace dies and leaves it as not another word, and he's really one part of himself talking to the other, not, you keep quiet, shut up, not another word. DeLillo is saying there's always another word. Yeah. It's okay. Yeah. And I think that like his memorial is like amazing. So yeah, hearing him say like infinity and Dave's voice, American. Chilling. Yeah. Very powerful.
Yeah. If you're unfamiliar with where to find these memorial letters, they're housed in a collection called The Legacy of David Foster Wallace, which is edited by Samuel Cohen and Lee Constantino. It's like one of the earlier, I would say, kind of like tertiary Wallace scholarship books. And it was like, I think the second one I got ever. Way those things before.
Were also, they've been published several places. They were also published in Harper's, and they were published in a publication online called Five Dials. So you can get the whole PDF of them at Five Dials. I will say there were two speakers there who did not grant permission for their speeches to be reprinted ever, and that was Mark Costello and Donald Antrim. And so you'll read them all except for those two who gave speeches there at the memorial, but they're not included. Franzen's in there, Saunders is in there, Zadie Smith, Jerry Howard, but you're not going to see Donald Antrim or Mark Costello, and it's too bad. They had really, really good personal, reminiscences of Wallace, but. The Don DeLillo. Anyways, we're getting kind of off track here, Dave. I don't know if you want to take a break and come back. We've only made it up. We haven't even made it into the 2000s here.
Not even close.
The letters.
Yeah, I think it makes relatively good sense to stop now or so, because I'm looking at my notes and I'm like not even quite a quarter of the way down to my down my notes page.
Yeah, I've got pages more of note cards and notes on a lot more to talk about, like at least another episode's worth.
Yeah, I'd say so. Okay, so that brings us to 1995. We're over an hour now, so we are going to make this part 1 of episode 49. We're going to put it out, as you will know if you're listening to this already, and then we're going to record as soon as we can to do a part 2 and finish going through the letters and the content and talk about some kind of final thoughts, final reflections that we have on them, and we'll release that after we have it, so you'll get these kind of a little bit scattershot, and I think that's maybe okay. It's kind of a cliffhanger. So we'll do the things that we do at the end of the show, Matt.
Right. I'm excited to talk about this again because I think there's a lot going on in these letters, and it's going to take us a while to go through them all. But we're in no rush. We hope you aren't either. And you can follow us on Twitter. Well, we will post some more thoughts there. We are at Concavity Show. Feel free to email us, concavityshow@gmail.com. com. We're also on Instagram at Concavity Show.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just post a picture of Don DeLillo's head or something there.
Yeah, totally.
Book cover, maybe not a picture of a letter. Unfortunately,
yeah, we can't do that. We cannot do that. We will go to jail. There will be no more Great Concavity episodes after that.
Be locked up for life. It's a life sentence.
Yeah. And of course, as always, we want to thank our Patreon supporters. And I really want to stress this, that a big reason why we decided to do Patreon is because, sometimes we travel to go to conferences, and if we don't have an academic affiliation, which neither of us do any longer, that's kind of expensive out of pocket. So in a really palpable, specific way, the Patreon supporters helped me fund my trip to Austin to do this, to make this episode and part 2. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but if there's a part 3, all of that possible. So I want to say a huge and really specific thanks to our Patreon supporters. And this is like evidence of how your money is helping and being used. So thanks for that. And speaking of which, we have a new patron, Robbie Sykes. Robbie, thank you so much for joining the team in the last week, and we appreciate you so much. As always, thanks to Robin O'Neill and Parquet Courts for their art, and we will talk to you guys very soon for part 2 of the Don DeLillo Wallace letters.
Turn on the wire.